Dead America. Kansas, Part 1. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 48. The sun wasn't up yet as the alarm in Atticus's room began to go off. It took him a few moments to wake up, the exhaustion from the previous week taking its toll on him. As he sat up, he winced in pain from the cracked ribs and dislocated shoulder. "You aren't a young man anymore," he groaned to himself. "You're gonna have to take it easy for a few days." He sat on the edge of the bed for several moments, clicking on a light and giving himself time for his eyes to adjust. At least, that's what he was telling himself. He didn't want to admit, even to himself, that he needed another few moments before he would be able to walk. Finally, he got up, throwing on a shirt and some slippers before shambling out of the bedroom. He walked quietly down the hallway, not wanting to wake up Susie or Evelyn. However, as he approached the kitchen, he noticed that the light was on. As he came around the corner, he spotted Evelyn standing there, pulling a couple of coffee cups out of the cupboard and setting them beside a fresh pot of coffee. He scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "And here I was, being careful not to wake you up," he said with a wince. "You've had a rough week," she replied, offering him a warm smile. "Figured you could use some good morning juice before you got to work." He let out a deep sigh as he sat down at the counter. "You are a godsend," he breathed as she poured the 2 cups and set one down before him. He took a deep breath above the steaming mug, savoring the scent before taking a small sip. "That is some fabulous stuff. Cost a couple of rations, but I managed to get 2 giant containers of coffee," she admitted as she blew on her cup of gold. "I hope that's okay." He nodded emphatically. "We have plenty of rations," he assured her, "and more coming in soon." "They sending you back out?" she asked. He nodded. "Yep, but not for a few days," he explained. "They're also paying me for my time to research." He hadn't explicitly told her about what he was looking at, for many obvious reasons, so calling it research was the best way to go. "I know you have a lot of work to do," Evelyn said, and he was thankful for her discretion. "Once Susie gets up and fed, I'll take her out for the day." He furrowed his brow. "Are you sure?" he asked. As much as he didn't want to kick them out, it was hard not to want to snuggle up with his daughter instead of work. And he couldn't do both, not with her curious eyes near such sensitive material. Evelyn nodded. "They cleaned up one of those kid fun zones a few blocks away," she said, "doing a grand opening for the kids in town. I figured it might do her some good to hang out with some kids her own age. And—" She trailed off, hesitating and pursing her lips. Actually getting to be a kid for a little while, Atticus supplied for her. "Yeah," she said, lowering her gaze. "I mean, it's hard enough for you and I to go through all of this. I can't imagine how she's processing it." He offered a smile. "She's a tough girl," he said, and not just to make himself feel better either. He knew his girl, and luckily, very independent. Evelyn smirked. "I'll remember you said that when a boy catches her eye," she teased. Atticus groaned. "Girl, it is too early in the morning for you to be putting that evil on me," he said, pointing a warning finger at her. They laughed, but quickly caught themselves and quieted down so they wouldn't wake her. "Okay, you go get to work," Evelyn said, shooing him off with a wave of her hand. "I'll bring in some breakfast and a refill in just a bit." He smiled as he got to his feet. "Don't know what I'd do without you," he said, raising his mug in a cheers. "And don't you forget it," she replied with a playful glint in her eye. He chuckled as he walked down the hallway to his office, getting in and flicking on the light. He powered up the laptop, giving it a moment to get going, nursing his coffee while he waited. Finally, it was up and he clicked on the file folder he needed, staring at the mountain of reports. "Guess I should start from the beginning," he murmured, and clicked on a file labeled Day 0 Report. It was a giant text file, and he let out a sigh before he leaned forward to read. Worst part of the job: paperwork. Chapter 2. Day 0. 1:15 a.m. Madison's cell phone vibrated on the table beside her bed, and she groaned as she slowly came out of sleep, patting around in the dark. By the time she got her hand on the phone, it stopped ringing and she snuggled back under the covers. "Damn telemarketers," she mumbled. "Get your time zones right." Just as she was trying to get comfortable again and let sleep pull her under, the phone vibrated again. She smacked her hand down on it and lifted it. The caller ID saying blocked. "Who the hell is calling you at this hour?" Jax groaned from beside her. "Let's find out," she said with a sigh and hit the answer button, pressing the phone to her ear. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "It's Mark's," came the familiar voice on the other end of the line. "I need you at your computer." Madison immediately snapped awake, not expecting to hear her handler's voice in the middle of the night. It took her a moment to gather herself to continue the conversation, because a situation starting like this didn't mean anything good. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked. "Computer, 2 minutes," he said, and the line went dead. Madison kept the phone to her ear as she got up from the bed. Okay. "Slow down," she said. "What's going on?" "Will you go in the other room?" Jack mumbled, pulling the covers up to his ears. "Sorry, baby," Madison whispered, making a show of adding to her dad. "Yeah, just give me a second, Dad." She stepped out of the bedroom, gently shutting the door behind her. She quickly shuffled down the hallway to her office, closing the door behind her. She paused for a beat, cracking it back open to make sure that Jax didn't follow her. She was agitated as she went to her computer, wired from being woken up so suddenly. She booted up the machine and plugged in a headset, sitting down in her office chair as she waited for everything to come to life. The desktop looked like any other normal person's machine. The background was a photo of her and Jax together at a party, being a happy, if not rough and tumble, looking couple. Various folders littered the desktop with labels like pictures, invoices, and several other innocuous things. Madison paused for another moment, listening carefully to make sure Jax wasn't in the hallway. When she was satisfied she was alone, she clicked on a small icon on the toolbar, which brought up a video chat program. She punched in a 15-character long password, which rang in to Agent Marks. A few seconds later, he appeared on the screen. "Good Mo," he began. "What in God's name is wrong with you?" Madison hissed, cutting him off in a low and controlled voice bubbling with rage. "Jax is in the bed next to me, and you call me at 1 o'clock in the morning." "Agent Madison, you know these people will kill me, right?" she snarled. "They wouldn't bat an eye to just drag me out back. Pop one in the back of my head, toss my body in a trunk, and crush the car. You know how I know that, because I've seen them do it." His eyes narrowed. "Agent Madison, we have specific meet times for a reason," she cut in. "Now, your reason for putting me in this kind of danger better be the single greatest reason in the history of the world. There's a time-sensitive task that needs to be done," he finally managed to say, "and you're the only operative in the region." She blinked at him for a moment in shock. "I've spent the last 18 months undercover, and you want me to go run an errand for you?" she demanded, barely able to keep her voice low. "That's what you're risking my life and this operation for?" "The operation is canceled," Mark said. "You have a new mission and it takes priority." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head back and forth slowly. 18 months, she breathed, then leaned forward, her gaze barely containing her rage. 18 months living amongst low-life bikers. 18 months of watching them bring in drugs and girls, only to be shipped off to God knows where. 18 months of having to do things that will haunt me until my final days. And you're canceling it when I'm so close to closing the case? "Agent Madison, by the time the sun comes up, none of that will matter," Mark said firmly. Her blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "There's been a terrorist attack on our nation," her handler replied. Her heart rate tripled. "What kind?" she asked. For lack of a better term at the moment, biological warfare, he said simply. The rage completely drained from her body as if someone had pulled a plug. She stared at her handler's face, the sincerity of his voice, which was quivering just a bit like he was privy to some things he really wished he wasn't. If she were to guess, she'd say he was frightened, which was as chilling as could be because she'd never known Agent Marks to ever be anything close to frightened. Where? She asked. Everywhere, he replied. She sat there for a moment, blinking numbly, not sure of what to say next. A beat later, a link popped up on her monitor. Just sent you the file on what we know, which isn't much, he said. In a nutshell, everybody with A-type blood is going to die within the next 48 to 72 hours, with the big cities beginning to see these deaths beginning within the next few hours, if they haven't already. She felt like she was living in a dream all of a sudden. Is there a way to stop it? She asked. He shook his head. It was unstoppable before we even knew it existed, he said. How many dead? She asked hoarsely. Just from this, he asked, and his gaze fell. 40% of the population. But that's not all it does. She rubbed her forehead, almost afraid to ask, she admitted. If someone dies with the virus, they come back, Mark said, almost sheepishly, as if he were embarrassed to say the words. She eyed him strangely, sure that her sleep-deprived brain wasn't hearing him properly. They come back, she repeated. What? I know how it sounds, but they come back and they attack the living, he explained. To make things worse, if someone is bitten, they'll reanimate upon death. She blinked at him, pressing a hand against her cheek. Zombies, she deadpanned. You're talking about zombies. Look, I know how it sounds, he said tiredly. But this is happening right now. And in a matter of hours, this country is going to be a war zone. She took in a deep, shuddering breath, gathering herself. Her initial thought was that this was a prank. It had to be. But she'd known Marks for years, and there was no way he'd risk her life for a prank. So as crazy as it sounded, it appeared to be the reality of what was happening to their country and its people. Are they killable? She finally asked. Destroy the brain, he replied simply. She nodded. Okay, got it, she said, and straightened. So, what's my mission? He eyed her suspiciously. You seem to be taking the whole zombie thing really well, he said. I trust you, she replied. Besides, I've been around long enough to know that there are some funky things out there in the biological warfare realm. While this sounds like a horror film, so do a lot of things I've researched over the years. So what's the mission? He typed on his keyboard for a moment, and a link came up on her monitor. She opened it up, and there was a one-page file inside. There's a viral researcher named Dr. Henry Monroe, he explained. He's about 6 miles from your location. Address is in the file I just sent over. You are to get to his house, secure him and his family, if they're healthy, and escort him to the Overland Park High School football field. A helicopter will meet you there in 2 hours for pickup. She nodded. Getting experts to safety. That's a smart play, she said. Get moving, because he may not be your only target tonight, he said firmly. Now that she was on board, he was all urgent business once again. Copy that, she said, but before she logged off, she leaned in. Hey, Marks. Yeah? He asked, brow furrowing. You and Becky safe? She asked. He swallowed, a flash of pain coming over his expression. I'm fine, he said softly. A group of us are relocating to a fortified safe house near the Pennsylvania line in the hills. Becky, she asked, afraid that when he hadn't mentioned her, that meant the worst. Visiting family in California, he said hoarsely, and she's A positive. She swallowed hard, unsure of what kind of condolences to give in such a situation. Nothing she could say would make this any better, any easier. A tear squeaked its way out of the corner of her eye, but before she could say anything, he shook his head. "Get moving," he said firmly. "We're all on the clock." She nodded sharply. "On it," she promised, and she quickly scribbled down Dr. Monroe's address as the feed went dead. She picked up her phone and typed it into the GPS. "Couple miles from storage," she thought. "Looks like I'm making a detour." She got up from the desk, walking towards the bedroom to get ready for battle. She wasn't sure what she was going to tell Jax. As she opened the door to the office, she was startled to see him standing in the hallway near the bedroom door. At first, she was concerned that he had eavesdropped, but relief washed over her when it was clear he was sleepily shambling from the bathroom. "Is your dad okay?" Jax asked groggily. She nodded. "He's in the hospital," she lied. "Some guy ran a stop sign and T-boned him." His eyes widened a bit, though he still looked dazed with sleep. "You sure he's okay?" "I think he's just shaken up. Has a little whiplash," she explained. "Something a bottle of pills and a fifth of whiskey can't cure." "You coming back to bed?" he asked, vaguely motioning over his shoulder towards the bedroom. "No, I gotta go over to the hospital," she said, giving him a rightfully apologetic look. "He says they're going to discharge him soon and doesn't have a car anymore, so—" "He needs a ride," Jax finished. "Okay, give me just a minute and I'll head out with you." She shook her head, feigning a smile. "You don't have to come with me," she insisted. "Besides, not sure that would be the best way for you to meet my dad." "No, it's not like that," he replied. "I just know you don't like people being in your house when you're not home. Even me." He approached her, wrapping his large tattooed arms around her shoulders. After being undercover for 1.5 years, it was second nature to her to slide her arms around his waist, despite not being able to stand the human trafficking dirtbag. "One day soon, when we have a place together, I hope you'll let me stay home by myself," he murmured into her hair. She forced out a light chuckle. "I know I'm weird," she said, nuzzling into his chest, "and I appreciate you being so understanding. I'm truly a lucky girl. And don't you forget it," he said playfully, lifting her chin gently and placing a kiss on her lips. He gave her one last squeeze and led her into the bedroom to find some clothes. "So where are you off to?" she asked as she dug through her dresser. "It's damn near 1:30, so no point in driving back home," Jax said. Groaning as he stretched, "I'll just head over to the shop, bunk down for a few hours in the back, and then get to work on Bertha." She nodded. "Okay," she replied. "If I can time it right, I'll be by when the sun comes up with coffee and donuts." "Just remember," he said as he slid a gray t-shirt over himself, "I like my donuts, like I like my women." He winked at her. Hot, glazed, and filled with cream. He laughed, proud of his own wit. Madison forced out a natural-sounding laugh, even though it made her soul vomit. "You got it, babe," she said. Once they were done getting dressed, they grabbed their essentials and headed out the door. She waved to Jax as he fired up his motorcycle, doing a loud burnout as he left the driveway, likely pissing off everyone sleeping in the near vicinity. Madison took a moment to gather herself as she got into her car, a relief settling over her at being able to drop the act. It hit her then that this was it. She'd never have to put on this act ever again. She could be herself again. A thrill ran through her, but reality quickly set in. "Okay, it's an easy milk run," she said to herself in the rearview mirror. "Get your gear, get the target, get on a helicopter, and then prepare to fight in a hellish zombie-infested apocalypse." She lost her breath for a moment at those words. Still not sure if she really believed them or not, she had a feeling she was going to find out, one way or another, just how accurate they were. She finally snapped out of it, starting up the car and peeling out of the driveway in her sedan. Chapter 3. Madison drove along the darkened road in Overland Park. The streets were mostly quiet, with only a few cars driving along, most likely patrons of bars trying to beat the closing time crowd home. She came up to a stoplight, looking down both directions. To her right was a neighborhood, which was completely quiet. To her left was a small business area with a few late-night restaurants and bars. There were a few figures on the street, moving erratically on the road and along the sidewalks. She contemplated investigating, not sure if they were a threat or just drunk people trying to hit a different bar before closing time. "You got enough to worry about," she muttered to herself, and when the light changed to green, she drove straight ahead, trying not to be concerned about what she hoped were just drunken bar patrons. She drove a few more blocks, eventually making the turn into a storage unit facility. Her headlights shot in through the front glass, and there was nobody inside. However, the TV was on, playing some sitcom from the 1980s. She paused for a few moments, looking intently, trying to spot anything out of the ordinary. Most nights she had come around there was a person working the counter, but there was nobody there. Probably just doing his rounds, she thought. Wouldn't be the first time. She pulled up the keypad, punching in her code. As she waited for the gate to open, she looked at the side of the keypad, noticing a tiny bit of wet blood. This put her on edge, and she leaned over, popping open the glove box and pulling out her handgun. She gave it a quick check, making sure it was good to go in case she needed it. The gate opened fully, and she drove through, stopping at the entrance to make sure it shut behind her, not wanting a surprise rear attack. After it was secure, she drove down the aisles towards her locker, pulling up just short of it. She got out of the car, gently shutting the door and listening carefully. There was very little in the way of noise, although she did hear some light footsteps coming from the next aisle over. After several moments of them not escalating, she got moving. She unlocked the padlock and slung open her unit, C-47. She hit a switch on the side, and a small light in the middle popped on. There was an assortment of guns and ammunition lying around, as well as a laptop in the back with stacks of papers beside it. She unplugged the laptop, shoving it into a bag before securing some weapons and other gear she shoved into her pockets. Rapid footsteps echoed outside, and she moved quickly back to the door, drawing her handgun as she made it to open air. She looked to her left, spotting two men running quickly towards her, roughly 30 yards away and closing, one of them a good 5 yards in front of the other. "Stop right there," she yelled. "I'm armed and I will put you down." They didn't respond, just continued to sprint towards her, now only 20 yards away. Madison hesitated for a moment, racking her brain to try to figure out her next move. She couldn't ignore what her handler had told her, though, so she didn't worry about possible repercussions, opting to open fire. She squeezed the trigger once, aiming for center mass. The bullet hit the lead man squarely in the chest and didn't slow him down in the least. "Shit, the head," she thought, adjusting her aim and squeezing the trigger but barely missing the target. It was difficult to hit with the speed he was coming at, combined with the darkness. The lead man was within 5 yards of her, with the other just a few seconds behind. She readied her handgun, but didn't fire as the first one closed in on her. As it got within arm's reach, she sidestepped it, shoving it aside with enough force to topple it over to the ground. As soon as it hit the floor, Madison focused on the second man, allowing him to get within arm's reach. She grabbed him by the shirt, using its momentum to spin them both around, slamming his back into one of the closed storage rooms. She put the gun underneath his chin, and at that point she took a fraction of a second to notice his face. The eyes were vacant, jaw snapping in a frenzied manner like a rabid animal on the attack. The word zombie flashed through her head in neon lights, and she pulled the trigger, sending the man's. No, the creature's. Brains up onto the metal door behind it. Madison quickly whirled around, taking aim at the ghoul that was nearly back on its feet. It took a moment to get its bearings, and by the time it did, she had its head lined up in her sights. She squeezed the trigger, sending a round through its forehead and dropping it to the ground. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily and trying to gather herself. She finally walked over to inspect the bodies, trying to control the shock quivering through her body. The first man she'd shot was a customer, looking like just an average middle-aged guy. She gave him a once-over, not seeing any wounds whatsoever outside of the one she'd provided. She moved over to the other man, who was wearing a polo shirt with the logo of the storage company. There was a nasty bite mark wound on his neck, a huge chunk of flesh missing. She sighed. "Looks like your friend there got hungry," she murmured. "I'm sorry, my man. That's a rough way to go." She stood up and headed back into her storage unit to grab her bag containing her laptop and ammunition, as well as an assault rifle and a shotgun. She loaded them up into the back of her car before locking up her unit again. As she went back to her car and started driving towards the exit, she saw a police vehicle sitting in front of the gate. As she approached, the lights on the top started going off, their way of letting her know they saw her. Madison pulled up to the gate, getting out of the car with her hands raised, and a couple of cops got out. Once they saw she was unarmed, they motioned for her to lower her hands. "Good evening, ma'am," one of the officers said politely. "Officers," she replied in an even tone. "What's going on?" "Got a call from the front desk clerk about an hour ago that there was a customer making some trouble," the second officer said. She shrugged, pasting an innocent expression across her face. "I haven't seen any signs of trouble," she said. The first officer pursed his lips, inclining his head towards the building. "What are you doing out here so late?" he drawled. "If you don't mind me asking." "Don't mind at all," she replied with an award-winning smile. "Working late tonight and decided to hit the storage unit on the way home so I could sleep in a bit tomorrow before going back." The second officer cocked a brow. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked. "Information specialist," she replied smoothly. "Been working with a new client overseas, so my hours are kind of strange. I'm sure you two can relate." Both officers chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Can't argue with that," the first one said, and motioned to the keypad. "If you wouldn't mind punching us in, we'll get out of your way so you can get home for some rest." She smiled. "Sure, I can do that," she said, and walked over to the keypad. Before she could punch in the numbers, the radio in the car began blaring. She couldn't fully understand what was being said, only that the dispatcher seemed frantic. The first cop ran to the still open door, leaning inside. The second officer turned to her. "Are you 100% sure there's nothing wrong in there, ma'am?" he asked. "Everything's quiet, officer," she assured him. "But if you need to take that, I can leave the front desk guy a note for you." They shared a look and a nod before the first one got back into the driver's seat. "Appreciate it, ma'am," the second officer said as he walked back to the passenger door. "You be safe tonight. Must be a full moon because people are starting to get crazy." "Will do, officer," Madison replied with a smile. "You two watch yourselves out there." He nodded and got into the cruiser, the two of them speeding off down the road. She let out a sigh of relief, glad they weren't going to go inside to poke around. It might have been difficult to explain why there were two dead bodies right outside of her unit. She punched in the code and got back into her vehicle, driving off into the uncertain night. Chapter 4. Madison cruised down the road towards the address Marks had given her. Since leaving the storage facility a few minutes prior, she had already passed 3 or 4 police cars with their sirens going, all of them headed towards the bar district. "Looks like the party is getting started," she murmured, shaking her head as she continued to drive along the main strip, occasionally glancing down at her phone for directions. As she did this, a car screamed through a red light, T-boning her car. Madison had a brief second where time slowed down, and she couldn't help but think that her making up the T-boning excuse to get away from Jax somehow brought this on her. Then she was flying around the cab, gripping the steering wheel tightly to steady herself. Finally, the car came to rest, and it took a moment for her to get her bearings. She checked her head, and luckily there was no bleeding. She started to move but winced in pain from the impact. Nothing was broken, but it was highly uncomfortable. She turned the key and the engine was dead. She smacked the steering wheel in frustration. "Guess I'm hiking," she thought bitterly, and put a hand on the door handle, freezing when her gaze fell on the vehicle that had hit her. A zombie stuck halfway out of the windshield, like it had been thrown from the inside and got caught in the glass. She got out of the car, immediately drawing her handgun while slinging her bag and weapons over her sore shoulders. She moved towards the other vehicle, carefully, taking note of the creature. It was still thrashing about, unable to move, trapped in the glass. The ghoul locked its roomy eyes on her, which unnerved her greatly. It had been a younger girl, no older than 14 or 15, zombified with chunks of flesh still caught in its braces. Madison moved cautiously over to the driver's side window, looking inside and finding a middle-aged woman sitting behind the steering wheel. She had one hand on her neck, trying to contain the bleeding, her breathing ragged and raspy. "Help," she said, voice garbled by the gurgling blood in her throat. "Help. Me." Madison gave her a sympathetic look, because there was nothing that could be done for the bitten woman. The only thing she could do was raise her gun, which made the woman's eyes go wide. "I'm sorry," Madison said. "It's the only way." She fired, hitting the woman in the forehead. Before the body was fully slumped over, she moved to the front of the car and executed the young zombie stuck in the windshield. Frustrated and in pain, Madison patted down her body for her phone, but she didn't have it. She went back to her car, looking through the windows and trying to find it. Finally, she did and threw open the door to grab it from where it had fallen on the floor. Luckily, the GPS was still functioning. As she got her bearings, several footsteps thundered towards her. The gunshots had essentially acted like a beacon, letting every one of those things in a 10-block radius know where she was. "Gotta get smarter," she berated herself. "You're behind enemy lines. Now move." She motivated herself to get running, even if the pain from the car crash was more intense than she wanted to admit. She managed to get to the side of a house with a waist-high wooden fence, sneaking through the gate and taking a knee. She poked her head up over the fence, making sure she was shrouded in shadow. The footsteps grew louder, joined by moaning and snarling. Within several moments, a dozen creatures emerged from the darkness, descending upon the car. A few of the zombies went straight for the driver's side door, reaching in and feasting on the still warm flesh of the driver. The others looked frantically around for anything else and began to wander away when they didn't find anything. Just as Madison got up to leave, police sirens blared. She took cover again, looking out at the road. Her first instinct was to warn them of the danger, but she knew that not only would they not listen, they'd see her guns and deem her a threat. Even if they did survive the encounter with the zombies, there was a good chance the police would want to detain her. She wasn't too pleased with herself, knowingly sacrificing a couple of officers. But orders were orders, and she had an important mission. There were bigger things at stake than a handful of lives. Still, she stayed put, wanting to see how the monsters would attack. As morbid as it was, witnessing that would be vital information as to how they worked. She clicked on her camera phone to video, holding it up as the police car arrived. Before the officers could even get out of the car, every zombie within view turned and sprinted for the car. The two officers got out, guns ablazing, but they were no match for the sheer ferocity of the creatures. Within seconds, they were overcome by the mob, vanishing underneath the pile, their last couple of shots muffled by the bodies. She hit stop, pulling the video back up and watching it again, looking for anything that might help her survive. She looked at the outer edge, seeing a couple of the creatures who had come running back slam straight into the wrecked vehicle, reaching out but not running around the car. So they get locked on, and that's it, she thought. No tactical ability, no thinking skills. Just run in a straight line towards their prey. That just might be useful. She clicked her phone back over to the map, seeing she was still about a half a mile to the house. She broke from cover, staying in the backyards of the houses, not wanting to risk the road. She moved several yards, stopping at the next crossroad, taking a knee beside the last house on the block. She looked out both ways, seeing a handful of creatures on the road and several more attacking houses. Apparently, someone made the mistake of turning on a light and attracted a crowd. She didn't see any creature within 40 yards of her, but the road she had to cross was littered with streetlights, making it a certainty that she'd be spotted. Knowing she was on the clock, she forced herself to get up, moving out from cover and darting across the road as quietly as she could. The transition from dead sprint to mall walking was instantaneous as soon as she reached the pavement. She moved quickly across, getting to the grass and immediately sprinting again. She made it to cover, looking around for trouble. Much to her surprise, she wasn't spotted, at least not by anything that was pursuing her. Madison continued moving up, getting across the next couple of blocks without trouble. Finally, she arrived at the target house, which had several lights on inside. She could hear moaning and banging coming from the front door, so she worked her way around the side of the house to investigate. She poked her head around and spotted a trio of creatures who were banging at the front windows. Trying to get inside, Madison moved back a few steps to a side window, looking into the living room, but not seeing anyone in there. Man, when they get locked onto something, they get really locked on, she thought, and worked her way to the back of the house, looking through windows every step of the way, but not seeing anybody. She went to the back sliding glass door, which she tried, but found it locked. She looked around, but didn't see any threat, so she pulled out a small lock-picking kit from her pocket. She went to work on the rudimentary sliding glass door lock, picking it with relative ease. She slid it open carefully, not wanting to make any noise. She got inside, shutting it just as carefully and locking it. Just as it closed, she heard banging and moaning echoing from the other side of the house. She pulled her knife from an ankle holster, readying it as she moved slowly and quietly through the house. As she came out of the kitchen into a hallway, she spotted a zombie that had recently been an older woman, frantically trying to smash its way through a door. Madison moved up the hallway, which was luckily carpeted so her footsteps were muffled. All the while, the ghoul had no clue that she was there, only focused on getting inside the door. She struck, stabbing the creature in the top of the head with her blade, dropping it to the ground without it ever even knowing she was there. She yanked the knife free of the zombie's skull, wiping it on the corpse's nightgown before sheathing it. She paused for a moment, then knocked on the door. "Anybody alive in there?" she called. "Who's there?" someone called back, voice high and shaky. "Someone sent me to get you out of here," she explained. "Really?" came the reply. Madison took a deep breath, putting a hand on her hip. "You know, this will go a lot faster if we can have a conversation that isn't through a door," she said. "Oh, right." The voice sounded less shaky and more normal now, and she pictured a man slightly older than middle-aged. "My apologies," he said, and there was a loud scraping sound behind the door, followed by the click of a lock opening. She stood back, not wanting to spook him as he opened the door, and he looked spooked, his eyes wide and his gray hair wild. "Are you Dr. Henry Monroe?" Madison asked, raising her chin. He looked confused by her question, shaking his head back and forth a bit. "Yes." He stammered his response. Before she could continue, he noticed the fallen zombie and his legs gave out. He sank to the floor in ragged sobs, his hands coming to his mouth. She sighed, realizing she'd been insensitive, and the corpse must have been his wife. She should have moved the body. But it was too late, so she gave him a brief moment to mourn before stepping in and taking his arm. "Okay, Doc, I'm going to need you to stay with me," she said firmly, picking him up off of the floor. He didn't seem to want to go, practically hanging from her grip like a sack of potatoes, moaning in agony. "My wife," he blubbered. I know, Madison said, her voice biting and firm. But if you don't focus on what I'm telling you, you're going to end up just like her. There will be plenty of time to mourn later. Still, he didn't move, and she snapped her fingers in front of his face to get his attention on her. When his eyes finally focused on her face instead of his wife's corpse, she pointed to the front of the house, where the banging and moaning and scratching echoed. "You hear that?" she said, inclining her head in the direction of the noise. "It's more of those things like your wife. And just like her, they want us dead." He blinked at her, fear quivering his thin body. "I don't understand," he stammered. "Who are you, and how do you know my name?" She was annoyed that he still wasn't moving, but at least his attention and interest in the situation was a step in the right direction. "I'm Agent Madison," she replied. "I was sent here to collect you." He didn't seem to compute for a beat. "Collect me?" he asked, eyes glazing over. "For what purpose?" "You got me, Doc," she replied, taking his shoulders and finally getting him steady on his feet. "All I know is that by the time the sun comes up in the morning, 40% of the country is going to be like those things outside. Whatever you do for a living has been deemed important enough to risk my life to preserve, so I'm going to get you where you need to go." She stared him down until he finally seemed to see her. Hear her. "Now I need you to get dressed as quickly as you can. Something comfortable that you can move quickly in. Can you do that for me?" "Yes," he breathed. Then, more firmly, "Yes." "And do you need anything to live?" she asked, looking around. "Medications, insulin, anything like that?" He shook his head. "No, I'm mostly healthy," he said, and a semi-hysterical laugh burst from his throat as he rubbed his cheek. "Good. Just want to make sure," she said, finally letting him go to stand on his own 2 feet. "If I'm risking my life, I want to make sure you aren't going to die a slow, painful death once I get you to safety." He let out a deep breath, finally straightening with resolve. "You're a charmer, you know that?" he asked her, sounding exhausted. "That's what I've been told," she quipped. "Now go, get ready. I'm going to figure out how the hell we're getting out of here." Henry disappeared back into his bedroom to get dressed, and Madison moved to the front of the house, peering out the window and trying her best to stay out of sight. The trio of zombies was still by the front window, and there were another half dozen or so in the street past them. Madison looked back towards the driveway at a late model sedan. By the front door, a ring of keys shone in the dim glow from the streetlights, and she snatched them down. "Okay, just gotta get past this first bunch and we're home free," she thought. "This can work. This can work." Chapter 5. Several minutes had passed as Dr. Henry Monroe got ready to go. Madison stayed by the front window, staying out of sight and keeping an eye on the situation, which had only gotten worse. A couple of the ghouls from the road were starting to head their way, not running, but attracted to the noise. She knew as soon as they exited the house that the monsters would be on them. She unslung her shotgun, checking the chamber and finding it empty. She reached into her bag, grabbing 2 boxes of shells, 1 buckshot and 1 slugs. After a quick debate with herself, she opted for the slugs. "Buckshot isn't going to work on something that doesn't feel pain," she murmured to herself. That one was straight through the windshield, and it was acting like it was nothing. The doctor exited the bedroom, a small bag packed in over his shoulder. "Who are you talking to?" he asked. She shook her head and sighed. "Nobody. Just me," she admitted. "Talking out problems, huh?" he asked with a knowing nod. She shrugged. "Yeah, I know it's odd, but it works for me," she said, finishing loading her gun and snapping it shut. "I do the same thing," Henry replied, offering a smile. "Do get some strange looks from my colleagues and my wife." The word choked off as he seemed to realize where he was and what had happened to him, and he quivered for a moment. Madison was sure he was about to dissolve and break down again, but he managed to pull himself together, taking a deep breath. "I understand and can relate," he finally said. You got everything you need?" she asked, inclining her head towards the bag. He patted it and nodded. "Few keepsakes, a change of clothes, and 20 pairs of boxers," he replied. She chuckled, shaking her head. "Finally, a man who has his priorities in order," she joked, and motioned for him to approach the window. He joined her, his eyes widening with horror as he looked out at his neighbors, hungrily trying to get into the house to eat them. "What is wrong with them?" he breathed. "Some sort of virus," she replied. He stepped back from the window, his whole body tensing at the mention of that word. "Virus?" he asked. "Are we in danger? I have masks." She shook her head, raising a hand to calm his babbling. "It only targets A-type blood, or so I'm told," she explained. He paused for a beat, and she assumed he was putting together that his wife had A-type blood. "Okay, that makes a lot of sense," he said with a solemn nod, "especially while you're at my house." He moved away from the door, heading back towards the bedrooms. "Where are you going?" Madison hissed, beginning to lose her patience with this man. "I need something else," he said over his shoulder. "We're not going to be able to come back," she reminded him firmly. "So make sure you grab everything you need." He nodded and headed into a room. He was only gone for a few moments before he returned, stuffing a large hard drive into his bag. "What you got there?" she asked, shaking her head. "Not sure you're going to have the privacy for your fun drive." He actually cracked a smile despite the situation, shaking his head as he slung the bag back over his shoulder. "Hardly," he said. "It's my research and all of my reference material. Now that I know why you're here, this is going to come in handy given the situation." "Guess I should have led with that, huh?" she said, feigning a sheepish smile. She was glad that she had him more focused, a bit more relaxed, and a lot more compliant. "No harm, no foul," he said, waving a hand in the air, even if it did lead to a bad joke. She nodded before leaning in, offering him a smile. "Chalk it up to a stress breaker and move on," she asked. "Of course," he replied, returning the smile. Relief flooded her. He seemed to both understand the gravity and realize that he needed to keep himself together to help himself, and maybe even the entire human race. And putting him at ease with her made for a much easier escort mission. "So, do you have a way for us to get out of here?" he asked. She smiled, raising the shotgun. "Pure force seems to be working so far tonight," she said. "See no reason to stop it now." "Where's your car?" Henry asked. She jerked a thumb over her shoulder. "Wrecked a few blocks back," she explained. "Of course," he replied with an emphatic nod. "Do you have the—" She cut in by raising his keyring and jingling the keys in the air. "That's a yes," the doctor said. "So here's what we're going to do," Madison said, slipping back into work mode. "I'm going to go out the back, come around the side, and ambush the three by the window here. As soon as you hear me start firing, you throw open that door and haul ass to the car. I want you to unlock it and get into the back seat, and make sure it stays unlocked, because I'm going to have company. Can you do that?" He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm old, but I can move when something's chasing me," he promised. "And they will be," she warned. "Now, is the car a push-button start?" "Yes, as long as the keys are in the cab," he replied. She held out the keys to him. "Don't lose them then," she said, and after he took them, began to head for the back door, her shotgun at the ready. "As soon as the first shot goes off, you move," she reminded him and waited for his nod as he put his hand on the deadbolt before she entered the kitchen. She reached the back door, sliding it open as quietly as she could before shutting it behind her just as softly. She immediately raised her shotgun, which was an auto-feed variety rather than a pump action, and began moving towards the side of the house. She came around the side, immediately ducking back behind cover as she saw more of the ghouls from the road approaching. She shook her head in disgust before quickly moving along the back of the house to the other side, coming towards the driveway. She stopped at the sight of a few zombies in the road behind the car, while the others were packed around the windows. She stood there for a brief moment, thinking to herself, "To hell with coming out the front door," she mused. "I'm just going to grab him and come this way." But before she could double back, one of the ghouls behind the car spotted her. It immediately burst into a sprint, only a few yards away, the noise attracting the one behind it. She had a split second to react, so her training kicked in. She quickly raised the shotgun and fired, taking the head clean off of the lead creature. She quickly adjusted her aim and fired again, taking the next one's head out. She knew she'd just put her target in extreme danger, so she rushed around the side of the house just as the door opened and fired as quickly as she could. The first shot hit the closest creature in the shoulder, ripping its arm clean off and knocking it to the ground. The next shot was more on target, taking off a head. They moved away from the house, hoping to draw them away from the door while giving Henry an avenue to run. The doctor burst outside, a creature immediately reaching out for him, but Madison took it out with a shotgun blast. He didn't even see it hit the ground as he took off running towards the car, keys in his hand as the agent continued to fire. As he approached the car, she fired off the last of the shotgun shells, but several creatures were still coming their way. She tossed him the shotgun, which he miraculously managed to catch, pulling out her handgun in one fluid motion. She fired towards the running zombies as he got into the car, slamming the door shut behind him. As soon as she heard that door shut, she turned and got into the driver's seat. "Buckle up, this is gonna be a hell of a ride," she warned, and strapped in as she hit the engine start button. It only took a brief moment for the vehicle to come to life. Just as the creatures reached the car, she slammed it into reverse, hitting the gas and screeching out of the driveway and into the street. She popped it into drive and sped away from the house, leaving the running zombies in their wake. A few blocks later, she made a turn, wanting to avoid the intersection where she'd wrecked. Another block up, the doctor seemed to relax a bit in his seat and shifted his weight. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Overland Park High School," she replied as she made another turn. "In 1 hour and 2 minutes, a helicopter will be landing on the football field to take us to safety." He nodded. "Do you know how to get to the school from here?" he asked. She tilted her head back and forth. "Just the main roads, which I don't think we want to be going on right now," she admitted. He nodded and leaned forward, motioning towards her. "Okay, hang a left at the next intersection," he said. "You know a back way to the school?" she asked, cocking a brow. "My wife taught there for 23 years, he replied, jaw set as he seemed to be overcoming the struggle of mentioning her. "The only way I haven't been there is through the air." Madison nodded. "Good deal," she said, and turned left, screaming around the corner. "Back seat, navigate away." Another block up, he motioned for her to turn right. "Go straight for about a mile," he instructed. "You'll have to cross over the main thoroughfare, but it's the far end of things." She hummed her affirmative and drove, and for a moment they were silent. She kept an eye on the sides of the road, finding only a handful of creatures nearby. She stayed careful, however, because after the car wreck she didn't want to take any chances. Getting the doctor across town on foot would be a far more difficult task than this. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your wife," she finally said. He took in a ragged breath. "I appreciate that," he replied quietly. "You want to talk about it?" she offered. To her surprise, he scoffed. "Talk about how my wife turned into a murderous monster who tried to take my life?" he asked, voice bone dry. "I don't think so." His tone softened. "But I appreciate the offer." She side-glanced him. "Offer stands, just so you know," she assured him. He nodded, leaning back in his seat, not answering verbally, but she got the message. Madison slowed down as they approached the crossover of the main road, her breath catching in her throat. It was total chaos, zombies everywhere, a couple of wrecked cars blocking one of the lanes, and a building on fire. Didn't take long for things to go to hell, did it? She murmured. Henry swallowed hard. Just so you know, this car has a V8, he said, and it sounded like another one of those stress busters. Madison had to admit to herself that it worked, and she shot him a lopsided grin. God bless you, Doc, she said, and floored the accelerator. The engine roared, picking up speed rapidly. They hit the intersection, sending a handful of ghouls launching off the side of the vehicle and into the air. She struggled with the wheel for a moment before maintaining control, keeping it centered on the road as they blew by the threat. She let out a whoop as they made it out the other side, smacking the steering wheel. So where to, Doc? She asked, exhilarated. 4 more blocks up, then hang a right, he said, prying his white knuckles from the door handle. School will be up half a mile on the left. And the football field, she asked, wanting to get a lay of the land. Opposite side of the school, he replied. There's a gate on side road that will take you down to the field. She nodded slowly. If we're lucky, we'll be able to find a house to lie low in for an hour, she said, then head over just before the chopper gets here. She made the turn, heading towards the school, but after a couple of blocks, she was forced to slam on the brakes. So much for luck, Henry quipped. Madison sighed heavily. Knew I was jinxed the moment the words left my mouth, she muttered. Ahead stood a couple hundred zombies outside the school, clogging up the road and stretching all the way to the fence around the football field. The fence was tall, about 8 feet, with barbed wire around every bit except for the gate. As they sat there, gunshots went off at the school, a few muzzle flashes appearing from upstairs on the 2nd floor. People taking refuge in the school, Madison mused dryly. Don't think it's going the way they planned it. Can we get through them? Henry asked, wringing the strap of his bag in his lap. She shook her head. Even with a V8, we won't be able to push through them, let alone the gate, she said. So what do we do? He asked, voice rising in pitch. I can't, she replied, letting out a deep sigh. My handler is offline, and I have no way to contact them. So, we get something bigger to get through them, the doctor declared firmly. We have an hour, don't we? She thought for a moment before closing her eyes, muttering obscenities under her breath. Of course this would be the only option, one that she was almost dreading more than just throwing herself into the pit of zombies and letting them have at it. Something the matter? Henry asked, eyeing her suspiciously. Very much so, she admitted, puffing out her cheeks on a deep exhale. I know how we can get a vehicle to get through there. He blinked at her in confusion. Well, that's great, he said, choosing his words as if he weren't sure why she was so melancholy about it. Let's go. It's not that simple, she replied, holding up a hand. The people who have the vehicle are dangerous, like kill you and throw you through the front window of your house for your family to find kind of dangerous. His eyebrows rose to his hairline. And how do you know that exactly? He asked. I was investigating them, she gritted out. Undercover. Has your cover been blown? He asked, and she closed her eyes in defeat, shaking her head. Then what's the problem? She groaned. How are you at acting? She asked. I played a wise man in the church nativity play, One Christmas, he replied, tilting his head back and forth. I wasn't asked back. Fantastic, she quipped. They're totally going to kill us. She put the car into gear, shaking her head. But if we don't try, then those things are going to do the killing. And I get the sense a bullet to the head is better than what they would do to us. Henry sighed. You're not exactly filling me with confidence, Agent, he said. Maddie, she replied. His brow furrowed in confusion. Come again, he asked. You need to get in the habit of calling me Maddie, she said as she turned the car around. Why? He asked, blinking rapidly. I thought your name was Madison. It is, but Maddie is what my dad calls me, she said simply as she drove down one of the side roads. Henry shook his head. still very confused. But I'm not your. Oh, yes. They are going to kill us, he drawled as recognition dawned on his face, pressing him back into his seat. See, we both have the same rosy outlook on life, Madison joked as she took the road towards Jax's junkyard workshop. We already sound related. Chapter 6. Madison sped through the streets to get to the junkyard workshop that was kind of away from everything else. As they arrived, several vehicles were in the lot, as well as a couple of bodies out front, where two big burly guys were dragging them inside. Looks like they had an encounter, she said. Good, Henry replied, inclining his head. Might work in our favor. Make it easier to convince them of what's going on. She nodded jerkily. I agree, she said, then fixed him with a sharp stare. But look, when we get in there, you let me do the talking. And no matter what you see or hear, you do not speak up against it. Do you understand? Yeah, but what am I going to see? He asked, cocking a brow. I'm not sure, she admitted, but these aren't good people. Just keep your head down and we'll get through it, okay? He took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, he agreed. I won't speak unless you tell me to. Good, here we go, she muttered, and drove up, rolling down her window and whistling at one of the guys pulling in a body. Hey, what's up, Madison? Biker asked, giving her a wave. What's going on? She asked, motioning to the body. Somebody can't handle their liquor. He shook his head. No clue, he replied, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. We were just coming back from the bar when these two assholes go crazy on us. Looks like you taught them a lesson, though, she said, feigning an eye of appreciation. Yeah, didn't have a choice, he said. We told them to get lost, but one of them took a chunk out of Johnny's arm, so that set us off. Her heart rate tripled at that news. Where's Johnny now? She asked. Inside, with Jax and the boy getting patched up. The biker replied. Get them inside and shut this gate. Lock it up tight, she instructed, voice forceful. Something going on? The biker asked, his brow furrowing. She nodded. Yeah, and it's not good, she said. Get this place locked down and get inside. He glanced at his partner, and they shrugged at each other. She knew she was pushing it a bit, because they weren't used to taking orders from her, but the forceful tone of her voice seemed to make them listen to her. We'll be right in, the biker promised, and Madison drove inside, parking just outside the front door of the workshop, which was a giant building with a sliding metal door. To either side was a junkyard, each filled with stacked and wrecked cars. They got out of the vehicle and she led the way to the door, opening it up. Madison walked in, Henry keeping as close to her back as he could. As they stepped inside, she spotted Jax pacing back and forth in front of a couple of guys bandaging up Johnny in a chair nearby. At the back of the room, there was a quivering woman chained up to a pipe on the wall. Henry's gaze flicked over to her, but he didn't say anything, as instructed, even though he really wanted to. He swallowed hard, and Madison resisted the urge to side-glance him and remind him to keep quiet. She had to trust that he could handle himself. Hey, that fucking hurts, Johnny yelled. That's what happens when you pour alcohol on an open wound, one of the biker nurses said. But if you don't start manning up and let me clean it, you'll really be crying when we have to lop your arm off with a buzzsaw once it gets infected. Johnny glared at him, but finally shook his head and turned his face away, squeezing his eyes shut. Yeah, just do it, he hissed. Jax finally noticed Madison, and his eyebrows rose. Didn't expect to see you tonight, he said, striding over. Yeah, things are getting a little crazy out there, she said, shaking her head. Needed your help. He blinked at her in surprise. Well, that's a first, he said. What can I do for you? I need Bertha, she said. He started laughing, and though it was deep and loud, there was a sinister undertone that Henry didn't like at all. Jax pointed towards a giant, jacked-up four-wheel drive vehicle along the wall, a slightly smaller version of a monster truck that populated rural fairgrounds. crushing smaller cars beneath it. "Oh, is that all?" he finally asked when he composed himself. "You want Bertha. Now why would I do that?" Madison cocked her head. "Because I'm your girl," she said, raising her chin, "and you love me." He barked a slightly less humored laugh. "Ah, yes. The girl who won't even let me set foot in her house without her there," he drawled. "The girl who takes mysterious phone calls in the middle of the night and then just randomly shows up with some old man." The accusation didn't even faze her. "Jax, meet my dad, Henry," she said. "It's a pleasure to meet you, son." The doctor spoke up, and the biker narrowed his eyes at him, as if he were trying to place him from somewhere. "Yeah, I'm sure it is," he murmured, rubbing his chin. "You know, you've seemed a bit off to me, Madison, and I could never quite put my finger on it until now." She didn't like where this was going, her body tensing. "I'm just me, Jax," she said in her best harmless female voice, widening her eyes. "Bullshit," he cried, laughing some more. "You've been playing me since day one, and now I can prove it, because I know for a fact that's not your dad." She shook her head. "He's raised me since." Jax whirled, drawing his gun smoothly and pressing the barrel against her forehead. She didn't blink or flinch, standing her ground because this was about to get very bad. She was fucked. "Go ahead. Lie to me one more time," Jax snarled, all humor gone from his voice. "Just one more time, Madison. That's all it's going to take. One more tiny little lie, and we can put an end to this." She didn't say anything because she knew he wouldn't hesitate to blow her brains out. What she did do, instead, was make a slight clicking noise to get his attention before flicking her eyes downwards. He glanced down, spotting her quick draw where her handgun pointed against his most favorite part of his body. "What do you say we calm down a bit, huh?" she cooed. "Go on and back up now. Lower that gun, too." Jax hesitated, his jaw ticking. "Or you can go ahead and pull that trigger," she said. "I'll be dead, and you'll merely be wishing you were, at least for a little while. Anyway, if you don't listen to me, you'll be dead by dawn anyway." He narrowed his eyes at her. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but there was curiosity in his voice. "Back up and we'll talk," she shot back. He finally nodded, taking a few steps back, raising his gun up to show he wasn't a threat before shoving it in the back of his pants. "Okay, let's talk," he said. "Why do you need Bertha? And why do you think I'll be dead if I don't listen to you?" First answer is easy. "I need Bertha so Henry and I can catch a helicopter ride," Madison replied smoothly. Jax sneered. "A helicopter ride, huh?" he drawled. "Didn't realize you had the cash to be chartering a late-night whirlybird." Madison glanced at the doctor, hoping that he would understand the underlying hang-on. This might get bad look in her eyes. He gave the slightest of nods. "Well, I can explain it," she said, her voice steady and smooth. "Now, this next part is going to be hard to hear, and I'm going to need you to stay real calm when I say it. I've already had a rough night, and the last thing I want to do is get into a shootout." Jax didn't look like he liked that, but said, "Okay." "I'm an undercover agent," she said, and in a blink, every man in the room outside of the still quivering Johnny drew handguns, aiming at her. She didn't flinch, continuing to aim at Jax, who was holding his gun again, but pointing it at the floor. "Might want to tell them to calm down," she urged. "It's okay, boys," Jax said, raising his free hand. "She's not going anywhere unless we let her. So let's hear her out." "Are you out of your mind?" Johnny hissed, cradling his arm and glaring at Madison. One of his nurse bikers nodded vehemently. "Yeah, I tend to agree with Johnny here," he added. "Let's just toss her in the crusher and get on with our evening." Jax let out a deafening whistle, making everyone but his ex-girlfriend flinch. "I said we're going to hear her out," he bellowed. "Anybody want to challenge me on that?" His voice held the air of authority that got him where he was, and nobody said a word, all of them piping down. He motioned to Madison. Continue. Those people that attacked you took a bite out of Johnny, she said, inclining her head towards the wounded man. They're not people. Not anymore. What the hell are you talking about? Johnny snapped. Jax held up a hand to motion for him to shut up. What are you talking about, Madison? He asked, and she almost would have laughed at the show of testosterone if this situation weren't so dire. There's been a terrorist attack, she explained. Somebody, I don't know who, so don't bother asking, released a bioweapon. By morning, half the country is going to be just like those things. The room went deadly silent, and she could see the wheels turning in their heads, weighing out whether they wanted to believe her or not. They looked around at each other, the atmosphere tense and awkward. Don't believe me, huh? Madison asked. You still got people at the bar? One of the bikers nodded. Yeah, a few, he said. Call 'em, she ordered. He looked over at Jax, who nodded, and he turned away and started dialing. While he was busy, Jax regarded Madison thoughtfully. So what are they? He asked. I don't know, she replied, shaking her head. Only thing I know is that it takes a shot to the head to bring them down. Their numbers are growing by the minute, and if you get bitten, you turn into one of them. Jax turned and glanced over at Johnny, who looked more angry than concerned. Are you shitting me, Jax? He barked. You going to listen to her? He rubbed his chin again. Considering it, he admitted. Didn't you say you popped around into its chest, but it didn't do anything to it? Johnny's eyes widened, his gaze filled with a healthy dose of fear. Yeah, but damn man, I got half a dozen things in my bag that can make you forget about pain. He insisted, voice rising an octave. If I hadn't have finished him off, he'd be wishing I had by now. Jax didn't seem to hear him, addressing Madison. How long until he turns? He asked. She shrugged. No clue, she admitted. The few times I've seen it happen, it's been after death. Somebody takes a nasty bite to the neck. A minute later, they're up and running around. The biker who'd been making calls returned to the group, his face pale. Can't get any of them on the phone, he said. They just not answering, Jax asked. He shook his head. One kept ringing. The other two went straight to voicemail, he said. That's because they're dead, and things are already starting to fall apart, Madison said. You gotta be kidding me, Jax, Johnny exploded, voice shrill. She just said she's an undercover agent. They have all that jamming technology. Jax ignored this outburst too. You said a headshot kills them, right? He asked. Yep, she replied with a nod. Jax raised his handgun and fired a round directly into Johnny's heart. Startling everybody, most of all, Johnny, he staggered for a moment, staring at Jax in disbelief before he slumped back, bleeding out. A moment later, and he was down for the count. Pin him down, Jax instructed. She's right, I don't want him running around in here. The large biker nodded, still pale, and did as instructed, flipping the corpse over onto his stomach and putting the full weight of his boot onto his back. That was a little extreme, Madison said dryly. Jax shrugged. He's been skimming off the top for months now, he said. Only kept him around because he was useful at getting the girls. Now that that's over, figured I'd let him be useful one more time. You know we're going to have a chat about that girl, right? Madison asked. He nodded. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, he drawled. If you're not right about Johnny, you and your dad aren't going to be around. Fair enough, Madison replied, still cool as a cucumber. Just make sure you have your gun ready. He waved his handgun with a flourish and a smile. They stood there in silence for several moments before Johnny twitched. At first, it was slow, but it was only a few seconds before he started thrashing about, moaning and trying to flip over and get up, teeth gnashing and throat snarling. Thankfully, the biker was too strong, and the zombie that was formerly Johnny couldn't get away. "Well, what do you know?" Jax asked, with something akin to professional curiosity, and walked over, popping a bullet into the back of the ghoul's head, leaving it in a puddle of brain matter and blood. He holstered his weapon before turning around to face Madison. "Here's the deal." He raised a finger. "You can use Bertha to get to the chopper, but you're taking us with you." She nodded. "You have a deal on one condition," she said. He smirked, shaking his head. "You're not really in a position to be making demands," he drawled. "Yet here we are," she shot back, holding her own. "You boys can come with us." She pointed to the girl in the back, "But she goes free." Jax glanced back at the shivering woman shackled to the wall. "Her?" he asked with a shrug. "Okay, I could care less about her." He snapped his fingers. "Untie her." The biker who'd held down Johnny stepped away from the corpse, gingerly removing his foot as if he were afraid it would come back to life again. He walked over and unlocked the shackles, escorting the woman back over to the group. Madison reached into her pocket and held out the keys to Henry's car. "You've been listening to what we've been saying?" she asked. The woman nodded, but didn't speak. "Good. My car's out front," Madison explained. "Big fella here is going to go open the front gate so you can leave. If you're smart, you'll get as far away from anything resembling civilization. Go find a farming community and hope they're nice about taking in strangers. Now go." She nodded and scurried out the door with the big biker in tow. Madison checked her watch, shaking her head. "What's up?" Jax asked. "We have 35 minutes to get back to Overland Park High School and get to the football field," she explained. "Okay, we leave in 5 then," Jax replied. She held up a hand. "Wait, something's still bothering me," she said. He cocked a brow. "Growing a conscience for betraying the man you claim to love?" he asked wryly. "No, definitely not that," she quipped. "You're a bottom feeder." He put a hand to his chest as if she'd punched him, but it was overly dramatic. "Oh, hurting my feelings over here, hon," he said, a smirk curling his lips. "Must not have been too much of a bottom feeder given some of the things we've done together." "Necessary evils of the job," she replied smoothly. "My only regret is that I didn't get to put you behind bars." His smirk widened into a full-blown grin. "Must eat you up inside to know that after going through all that, you're going to end up helping me survive," he drawled. "Again, necessary evil to get the job done," she replied, sounding casual, but inside, he was right. It churned her guts. "So, what's bothering you then?" he asked. "How did you know he wasn't my dad?" she asked, motioning to Henry. "He never even said a word, and you busted him." Jax chuckled. "His wife was my favorite teacher when I was in school," he explained, and it sounded so absurd in the moment. Madison, imagining him as a teen, saw his picture every single day, sitting on her desk. He even came in a few times to talk about his job as a researcher. And I know for a fact that they don't have kids. She broke into hysterical laughter as it sank in, breaking her calm, cool facade like a little part of her brain had just broken. Jax cocked a brow. "Not sure why that's funny," he said. "Oh, it's hilarious. Believe me," she gasped through her mirth, finally catching her breath. "I spent so much time crafting my backstory, accounting for every single contingency that might have come up with you or your men. And the thing that busts me is you paying attention in school. That has to be longer odds than winning the lottery." He shrugged and smirked. "That's what you get for underestimating me," he drawled. "Rest assured, I won't make that mistake again," she said. And something charged between them, and they stared at each other with no trace of humor left. It was a harsh stare down, as if they were both dealing with the fact they were playing a dangerous game. They finally nodded to each other, then broke apart to get ready for the frantic run to the school. Chapter 7. The group pulled up a couple of blocks away from the high school, sitting in the middle of the road. There were a few creatures nearby who shambled towards them, but the vehicle sat a good 3 feet off of the ground, so they were of no threat. Most of the group inside looked down at them, clawing, trying to get in. They were silent, just trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Some of the zombies were clean, while others were missing huge chunks of flesh. All had that blank stare of hunger in their eyes. Jack sat behind Bertha's steering wheel, with Madison in the passenger seat and the other 4 people, including Henry, squeezed into the back. The engine was a little wobbly, but it stayed on. "She going to make it?" Madison asked. "My girl will get us there," Jax replied with a firm nod. "I've been giving her some tender loving care, and she appreciates it." He tapped on his handgun, which was holstered, but the side eye he gave her while he did it made her roll her eyes. "Oh, come on, I know you're not the brightest bulb in the box, but even I know you're not going to do a damn thing to me," she drawled. "You know I'm your only ticket onto a government-owned helicopter, and given everything that's going on, they'll cut you down without a second thought. So why don't you save your false bravado for someone who it might actually work on?" He smirked and put both hands on the steering wheel as a show of faith. "Just so you know," he warned, "if you do try to screw me, I will put you down." "Whatever," she quipped, the noise non-committal and half-hearted, and she looked up at the sky. "If you don't mind me asking," Henry asked timidly from the back seat, "how are we going to get to the helicopter?" "Well, Dad," Jack said, stretching out the word and lacing it with sarcasm, "Bertha here is one of the baddest machines in the state, and it will roll over anything and everything that is stupid enough to get in front of it. So why don't you sit back and relax, and let the guy who could have been your son-in-law chauffeur you around?" "My concern isn't getting to the football field," Henry replied, his voice surprisingly calm as he ignored all the jabs. "My concern is being there long enough for the helicopter to land and us loading up before we're overrun." Jax gave him a slight nod of appreciation and rolled his head towards Madison. "Dear old Dad has brought up a good point," he drawled. "You going to enlighten us about your plan? If you can manage it, you're going to drive us up to the gate and park it," she replied, motioning the trajectory with her hands as she spoke. "Then we're going to pop out the windshield and climb over. If what you said about the crowd is true, then we're going to have a lot of heat coming our way," Jack said. "That gate isn't going to hold very long, even with Bertha in the way." She nodded. "That's why we have to get it just right," she explained. "As long as they see us coming, they'll hold the chopper." He cocked a brow. "You willing to bet your life on that?" he asked. She jerked a thumb over her shoulder, motioning to Henry. "He's more valuable than any of us," she said. "If they have a chance to get him to safety, they're not going to abandon it." "What about it, Dad?" Jax drawled. "You healthy enough to climb a fence and do some football field wind sprints?" Henry raised his chin, ran a half marathon a few months back. He said haughtily, "May not be the fastest, but I'll get there." Jax gave Madison a mocking look. "Who knew Pops was an athlete?" he teased. She shook her head, ignoring his jab, and finally spotted the helicopter as it made its inbound approach. "Go, go!" she cried. Jax hit the gas pedal, and they sped off, leaving the creatures directly outside in the dust. The school was a few blocks up, and it didn't take long for them to see the mob that had formed outside, all still trying to get into the school building. "Hang on, this is going to get bumpy," he warned, and clicked Bertha down into 4-wheel drive mode. They lurched forward as all of the wheels kicked on. The back edge of the mob turned around at the sound of the roaring engine and began sprinting towards them. "Cut across the yard," she barked. "Planning on it," he shot back, and waited until just before they were about to impact the first creatures to turn the wheel. The tires screeched as the vehicle veered off of the road, smacking a few cools with the front corner of the behemoth. They got to the yard of the last house on the corner, the tires digging deep into the sod and kicking it up as they tore across it. They got back to the road, and Jax adjusted the steering accordingly. but they were greeted with another mob of ghouls that were between them and the fence. Hang on. The impact was severe, with the front grille smashing through the first several rows of ghouls before Bertha began to slow down. Bloodied hands smacked against the side of the vehicle as they pushed through the mob. They bounced up and down as the wheels crushed the creatures underneath it, and they pushed towards the fence. Bertha's engine started to stutter as they pushed through, with Jax gripping the steering wheel tightly. Madison glanced over at him, not saying anything snarky, because she knew that if Bertha went, their apocalypse was over. There was no use pointing it out or breaking his focus. The gate was about 10 more yards away, with a pack of ghouls standing between them and it, all of them focused on Bertha. This changed when the helicopter showed up over the football field and began descending, about 20 or so of the ghouls turning back and trying to get into the fence. The group watched in horror as the gate started to give way, rocking back and forth and beginning to come off of its supports. Madison didn't hesitate, bringing her feet up to her chest and beginning to kick hard at the windshield. After her second kick, Jax yelled, "What the hell are you doing? If that gate goes, we're fucked." She huffed and kicked again. Jax nodded and started shoving the windshield. It didn't take long for them to pop it out. As soon as the glass was out, Madison grabbed an assault rifle and took aim. She opened fire, sending rounds rapidly into the skulls of the creatures near the gate, focusing on the center of the mob. The additional noise did some good, as the creatures who were pushing to get to the helicopter turned back towards them. Still, she continued to put them down one by one until the gate was safe. As she stopped firing, she turned and saw Jax with a look of awe on his face. "I had no idea you were that good of a shot," he breathed, impressed. "Just make sure you remember that before you try to pull something," she quipped. He smirked and pulled Bertha up to the gate, stopping just a few inches short. There were hands on either side of the vehicle, but they could barely reach the top of the hood, let alone grab onto anybody. "All right, everybody out of the pool," Jax instructed, and he went first, getting out onto the hood. He took a look down at the mob of zombies on either side, taking a moment to steady himself from the subtle rocking they were causing. He extended his hand down to Madison, and she took it, letting him pull her out. When she straightened, he looked her in the eye and smirked. "Bold of you to trust me like that," he drawled. "Look around. I'm your ticket out of this," she snapped, taking her hand back. "Now help them out of the back while I get over the fence." Jax glared at her, all humor gone. "Dad's going over last. Just so you know," he said firmly. "Not going to have any of this make a run for the chopper nonsense." "Wouldn't dream of it," Madison replied, and hopped the fence, hitting the ground and doing a quick sweep. As soon as she saw it was clear, she pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it a couple of times to the chopper to let them know they were on the way. The chopper landed at center field, and a trio of soldiers got out to secure the area. It was a large transport helicopter, with a 50 cal gunner on the side facing them. She stepped away from the gate as one of the bikers hopped over. It took a few moments, but finally everybody was over, and they started jogging towards the helicopter. As they got within 10 yards, the soldiers raised their weapons and started barking out orders. They had to yell because of the blades still churning overhead. "Nobody take another step," the sergeant bellowed, and everyone froze, raising their hands. "Agent, step forward." Madison did as instructed, walking slowly over to him. Once she was there, he did a cursory visual inspection of her. "Have you been bitten?" he asked politely. "No," she replied. "None of us have. And yes, I know the implications of a bite. I'm not going to endanger us by lying about it." Her words had the intended effect, and he nodded. "Who's the cargo?" he asked. She pointed to Henry, motioning for him to come over. Jax reached out to try and stop him, but Madison shot him a hard look, and he thought better of it. "I'm Dr. Henry Monroe," Henry said, holding out his hand. Please get on the chopper, sir, the sergeant said, ignoring the handshake in favor of keeping his weapon at the ready. Henry nodded and did as instructed. It will be a tight fit, but we have room for your friends, the sergeant said. She looked back at the bikers. Oh, they're not my friends, she said. If they move, put them down. The sergeant's brow furrowed. Ma'am, he asked, clearly confused. Trust me, the world will be a better place without them, she said dryly. The sergeant nodded. Ma'am, he said, and raised his radio to his lips. If they move, put them down, he instructed. The other two soldiers moved into an attack position, and Jax's eyes widened with fury. What the hell? He cried. I thought we had a deal. And that's cute. You think I would honor it, she said, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. So you're going to leave us here to die, he demanded. She regarded him coolly. At least I'm giving you a fighting chance, she said. I would put you down, but I don't want to waste the bullets. Besides, my night is just starting. Consider us even for the lift. Oh, and I would think twice about trying to take shots at me, because I get the sense you're going to need every bullet you have. She motioned to the gate that they'd so carefully protected. Jax just laughed, shaking his head. He'd been had, but he had to have known that this was how it was going to end. Madison got on the chopper along with the soldiers and watched the bikers just standing there, staring up at her as they got smaller and smaller. Just outside the fence, the mob of ghouls grew, drawn to the sound of the chopper as it vanished into the night. Chapter 8. Madison looked over the town, seeing small fires beginning to pop up. There were figures on the streets running in every direction, but she couldn't tell if it was zombie or human or both. There were also flashing lights from police cruisers and rescue vehicles filling the night sky. Regardless, she was just happy to be in the air and away from the chaos. Sergeant Gibson handed her a headset, and she put it on, allowing them to talk. You good, Agent? He asked. She nodded. Just a little sore, but I'll manage, she replied. That's good, because your night isn't over, he warned. She let out a sigh, shaking her head. Of course it isn't, she said dryly. What do they want me to do now? Gibson reached into a small compartment underneath his seat, pulling out a small notepad and handing it over. Madison took it and read the page, finding a name. Dr. Betty McGill, the depot at Gibson Mill. 435 Concord Avenue, apartment 645. She cocked a brow. Concord Avenue? She asked, voice rising in pitch. Is this downtown? He nodded, but had the grace to look a bit regretful about it. Just on the outskirts of it, he said. She let out another sigh, shaking her head, because she knew what that meant in this undead climate. Okay, so what's the plan? She asked, pocketing the notepad. It's starting to get a little chaotic out here. I'm going to be hard-pressed to extract someone, especially if they're older, like Henry here. Gibson shook his head. No extraction, he replied, at least not yet. Madison blinked at him, finally having enough and letting her incredulity show. No extraction, she asked. So what? They're sending me to die alongside the good doctor. Don't want her to be lonely or something. Plans are in motion to retreat from the front lines and regroup in Kansas, the sergeant explained. Once that's been solidified, there will be an extraction team sent in to retrieve you. And how long is that going to take? She asked. Hopefully, not longer than a couple of weeks, he replied. And his eyes betrayed that it wasn't the kind of answer he really wanted to give. But it wasn't his fault, and she knew how it was. There was always somebody higher up making the hard decisions, and everybody else had to fall in line. Well, I hope the doc went to the grocery store before this hit, Madison quipped. Gibson smiled and pointed to a duffel bag on the seat next to him. 3 weeks of rations for 2, he said. Between that and what she has on hand, should be enough to keep your bellies full. She nodded, "What about security?" she asked. "The building is a renovation job on an old factory," he replied. "Steel doors, and her apartment is on the 6th floor, so you won't have to worry about windows." She filed that away. "How am I getting there?" she asked. "We got a landing spot half a mile from the building," he replied. She scoffed. "Oh, well, don't make it easy on me or anything," she drawled. The sergeant winced. "Sorry, I wish we could get you closer, but it's just not possible," he said, tone laced with sympathy. "There's not a lot of open space down there, and the only helicopter-friendly rooftops are going to be downtown war zones." "So, where are you dropping me?" she asked. "There's a supercenter just off the main road," he explained. "We're going to drop you off on top. You'll have to figure it out from there." She shrugged. "Okay, let's do it," she said. Gibson nodded, and they continued flying. As they approached the supercenter, he spoke up again. "That building right there, close to the river," he said, pointing. "That's your target." "You at least getting me on the same side of the river?" she asked. "Yeah, don't worry," he replied. "Not going to make you swim." She chuckled and took in a deep breath, looking out the window and taking a moment to herself as she surveyed the chaos and carnage taking place below. One more run, she thought. Just one more run. Chapter 9. The helicopter landed on top of the supercenter, and Sergeant Gibson helped Madison out and onto the roof. She had her shotgun slung over her shoulder, the assault rifle in hand, and 2 bags slung over her other shoulder. She gave him a thumbs up before looking over to Henry, who gave her an appreciative nod. As she got clear, the chopper took off, vanishing up into the night air. The first thing she did was take off the bags, giving her body a moment to rest as she figured out how she was going to get down from the building. She walked to the front where there were a dozen or so vehicles parked and zombies all around, running towards the building. A gunshot popped off inside, which was followed by silence. Madison spotted a hatch that went down into the floor, and she walked over and opened it up. There was a ladder that led down to where some air conditioning units and vents stood. She didn't even bother trying to find a way down, since the floor was a mess. There were zombies everywhere, bodies and blood coating the floor, and with more coming to the front, it wasn't an option. Madison gently shut the hatch before walking to the back of the building. She looked down and saw just a couple of zombies in the back alley, which bumped up against a fence and a vacant lot on the other side. It was overgrown grass and brush, and she didn't see any movement there. However, there were plenty of ghouls far in the distance on the streets, but they were focused on other poor souls. She took a moment to get her bearings, spotting the tall warehouse building in the distance. It was going to be a hell of a run. She spotted a ladder close to the far corner that would get her most of the way to the ground. There were a couple of zombies within 10 yards of it, which would make life difficult. She looked around the top of the building, finding a handful of rocks scattered about. She collected them and moved over to the center of the building. She dropped them all at once, backing up and listening as they crashed on the pavement below. While it wasn't terribly loud, it created enough of a diversion to draw the creatures away from the ladder. Madison picked up her bags, slinging them over her shoulder and moving quickly towards the ladder, giving it one last check before descending. As she got most of the way down, the cover that protected the bottom few rungs got in her way. She had no choice but to hop down. She landed hard on the ground, the weight of her bags causing a louder than anticipated thud. Immediately, there were excited moans from the creatures up the alleyway, which were followed by rushed footsteps. Madison looked over to the fence, which was several yards away, and she knew she'd never make it in time. She did the one thing she didn't want to do, which was open fire and draw attention to herself. She quickly aimed and fired a couple of times, the bullets well placed, and took out the closest 2 creatures as they got closer to her. As soon as they were down, she started running to the fence, which was chest high to her. She leapt up, throwing her weight at the top of the fence without regard for her safety or well-being. The bags cleared the top, their weight pulling her over quicker than she'd anticipated. She landed with a thud on the ground, knocking the wind out of her. She gasped for air, but was startled when several zombies smacked into the fence at full speed. That was enough to get her back to her feet and moving. The first thing she did was sweep the field, making sure her shots didn't attract any more attention. She heard moans and footsteps in the distance, pounding on the pavement. The grass was high enough that she took a knee, which gave her partial cover. She could see the silhouettes of the creatures looking around for the source of the noise. They thrashed about for a moment, almost like they're upset that they couldn't find it. A moment later, a car alarm went off in the distance, which drew them away. Madison stayed low while moving through the brush, stopping just before the edge of it. There were a few creatures down the block, but far enough away that they weren't onto her. She quickly got up from hiding, darting across the road and taking up position by a large brick building, glancing back out to make sure she made it unseen. She raised her rifle, keeping it pointed downrange as she went down the alley. It was incredibly dark, providing her with cover. She paused as she moved up, a mob of creatures chasing a terrified man down the street, running right by the opening of the alley. She shook her head, knowing she couldn't do anything about it. Once they were clear, she moved up, stopping at the top of the alley. She looked in the direction of the man, and there was a pack of ghouls laying on top of someone, feasting. They were half a block down and fully distracted by their meal. She broke from cover, running across the street, maneuvering around the cars parked on the road, taking a crouched position on the other side of the row. The sidewalk on that side was clear, so she moved up toward the target building. As she moved up the street, using the cars for cover, she was forced to pause when she saw a pair of legs sticking out slightly from in between two vehicles. A moment later, a creature leapt up from it, a chunk of flesh still in its mouth, looking around its next target. The moment was a quick one as the ghoul looked in Madison's direction, letting out a moan. Before it could even take a step in her direction, she opened fire, one single round to the head. This set off a chorus of nearby moans, way more than she cared to count. Madison knew her cover was blown, and she got up and ran as hard as she could down the next alleyway. Only a few yards from her position, the herd thundered behind her, picking up steam as the bags weighed her down. Halfway down, she noticed one of the back doors of a business was propped open. She didn't know where it led, but anywhere was better than where she currently was. She made it to the door, flinging it open, kicking the bucket that was propping it and slamming it shut behind her. She didn't have time to rest, quickly raising her weapon and doing a sweep of the room she was in, which was a kitchen. There wasn't any food being prepared, and everything was mostly clean, likely the chefs getting assaulted as they were shutting things down for the night. She moved through the kitchen, making sure she was alone. She got a little apprehensive, heart rate rising when she saw signs of a struggle, pots on the floor and blood in a pool on the ground. There was no body to go along with it, though, which meant it was up and running around. As she looked around, something crashed in the next room, and she whirled to aim towards the swinging double doors. She moved up slowly towards the doors, which had small cutout windows at head level. The lights were on in the next room, and she could see movement in the distance, but couldn't tell what it was. When she made it to the window, a creature came up on the other side at nearly the same moment, startling her. The zombie accelerated, pushing through the door and smacking into her, knocking her back a couple of steps. The door was the only thing preventing the zombie from being able to full-out tackle her, but the force of the impact caused her rifle to hit the ground. Much to her relief, only one ghoul managed to get through the door, but it was a big boy, easily 250 pounds and tall. The muscle-bound former waiter looked around, locking eyes on the fresh meal and making a run for her. Madison spotted a chef's knife on the counter, grabbing it quickly as the zombie closed in. She managed to get it up to head level just in time, not even having to use much force to get it through the skull. Between his momentum and the weight, it was more than enough to get the job done. She caught him, nearly toppling over as she gently put him on the ground. Even with the full force of her strength, He still hit the ground kind of hard. It was enough noise to get Madison to raise her weapon towards the door. Just in case, she stayed in the crouched firing position for several moments, waiting for an attack that didn't come. Finally, she forced herself to get up, moving over to the door and looking out. It was a mid-sized restaurant, like an upscale greasy spoon. There were 3 creatures near the front door, ripping someone apart, and she looked side to side, but that was the only way out. The front door was a breezeway-type entrance, with 2 doors and a small room in between. She gave it a moment, trying to look through the front window, but she couldn't see any movement. She contemplated using her gun to finish them off, but thought better of it because she didn't want to make too much noise. She looked at the front door, noting that it opened inwards. "Let's hope that they're not smart enough to pull," she thought, and pulled the knife out of the creature's head, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. This is a bad idea. This is a bad idea. She psyched herself up, pushing the door open and giving a light whistle, just loud enough for the creatures to hear. All 3 of them looked up at the same time, letting out moans and breaking away from their food, sprinting down the aisle towards the door. She got down behind it, making sure her face was still visible in the window. As soon as they got within a few feet, she stepped off to the side to let them crash through it without any resistance. They tripped over themselves as they came into the kitchen, giving her a brief window. She rushed through the door, letting it swing back towards them as she rushed through the restaurant towards the front. As she approached the door, the guest that the others had been feeding on began to stir. Madison pumped her legs as hard as she could, making it to the door just as the creature sat up. The mangled corpse reached out for her, narrowly missing as she got through the door, pulling it closed behind her. The creatures from the back came rushing out as the former dinner guest stood up and started smacking on the glass door, trying to get to her, but they couldn't. They pressed against it enough that Madison felt comfortable letting go of the handle. "So glad you're dumb," she thought, and turned, looking down the street, not seeing anything moving at the moment. She took a deep breath and got her bearings, figuring that she was still 2 blocks from the target building. She slipped out the door, sweeping the area with her rifle before moving up the road. She stayed in a combat-ready position, rather than going at a full sprint, partly for protection, but partly to minimize her footsteps. She moved up another block, poking her head around the corner and laying eyes on the target building. There was a large open courtyard that led up to the front doors, with several zombies outside of it trying to get in. She moved up the block, staying close to the side, stopping a few yards from the corner so she could get a better look. The courtyard began just across the street, with a knee-high brick wall that went around it with a couple of breaks for pathways. There were around a dozen or so zombies in the courtyard, trying to get into the building, and several creatures inside trying to get out. Madison looked around the area for an entrance, seeing a set of glass double doors to her left. However, there were creatures on both sides of the glass pushing, and the doors weren't moving. As she looked around for another way in, footsteps thundered from behind her. She turned towards several zombies spread out across the road and coming her way. She wasn't sure if they had spotted her or were drawn to the noise of the courtyard creatures, but she wasn't going to stick around to find out. She broke from cover, running hard across the road and into the courtyard. She leapt over the small fence, raising her rifle as soon as she was on the ground. She opened fire, sending half a dozen rounds towards the big window directly in front of her that just had one zombie on the other side. The glass shattered from the force of the bullets, alerting the other creatures nearby to her presence. She ran at the glass, leaping through the opening and into the front lobby of the building. There were moans and footsteps that erupted from every direction, all coming towards her. Madison started running, hoping to spot the stairwell. As she went, a couple of zombies came up from the back of the clubhouse. She aimed and fired as she moved, hitting them in the head and dropping them both. She reached an intersection, looking both ways. To her left was an elevator. To her right, the gym, and zombies came down both corridors towards her. She looked down towards the elevators and for a brief moment contemplated giving them a shot, but thought better of it. She sent a few rounds down towards them, hitting one creature and sending it to the ground to trip up the next few. She still couldn't find the stairwell, so she ducked into the gym, pulling the door shut behind her and flicking the deadbolt on it. She spun around and swept the gym, not finding any creatures, so she relaxed for a brief moment as the zombies smacked into the door, trying to get in. The gym was large, running all along the hallway to the back wall of the building, with another door at the far end. She clicked off the lights, hoping it would conceal her a bit as she figured out her next move. She walked along the wall, looking out for the stairwell. Finally, she spotted it in the far corner of the hallway. However, there were several creatures between her and the door for it. Madison contemplated for a moment and shrugged. "What the hell?" she muttered. "What's the worst that can happen?" She smacked on the glass about the midpoint of the gym, getting the attention of the ghouls, moving them away from the stairwell. She ducked down, staying out of sight, and moved to the other gym exit, quietly slipping out and across the hallway. She opened the door and rushed inside, quietly shutting it behind her. Movement shuffled from the landing above her, and she spun around, aiming her gun. "Don't shoot," a young man cried, throwing his hands into the air. He was sitting with his back pressed against the wall and looked no more than 25, clad in a club shirt splattered with blood, his face deathly pale with fear. "Don't shoot." "Are you bitten?" she demanded. "No, I'm good," he said shakily. "This isn't my blood." "You live here?" she asked, inclining her head. He nodded. "Yeah, 304, he stammered. "Get to your apartment, lock it up tight, and don't come out until the military comes," she instructed, leaving no room for argument. "You got me?" The man's hands were still in the air. "When is that going to be?" he asked shrilly. "Wish I could tell you," she quipped. "Now move." She went up the stairs, picking him up by the shirt and jerking him to his feet. She practically dragged him up the stairs to the 3rd floor, but before she could open it, he seemed to come to his senses and wrenched free of her. "Wait," he huffed. Madison sighed. "I don't have time for this, dude," she said. "Those things are everywhere," he stammered. She pursed her lips and put her foot against the door, opening it ever so slightly so she could see without being bombarded. There was some movement down the hallway, and she shut the door silently. "How the hell are they up here?" she asked quietly. "They take the elevator." He shook his head. "There's an open stairwell on the other side of the building," he explained. "Each floor has a community space by it." She cocked a brow. "Are you really giving me a sales pitch for the building?" she asked. "Sorry," he babbled, waving his hands in front of his face. "I'm new to the building, and it was the feature that sold me on it." She shook her head and sighed. "Where's your apartment?" she asked. "3rd door up on the left," he replied. She nodded. "You got your keys?" she asked. He nodded, pulling them out of his pocket and holding them up. "Yeah, right here," he said, though they jingled in his hand because he was shaking so badly. "Okay, here's what's going to happen," she said firmly. "I'm going to open this door and you're going to run to your apartment." He paled even more, if it were possible. "But those things will be dealt with by me if they get close to you," she interrupted. "But, look, man, I got places to be," she snapped. "You have my help for the next 30 seconds. Either use it or fend for yourself. What's it going to be?" He swallowed hard and nodded furiously. "Attaboy," she said, and threw open the door. She aimed downrange towards the closest creature, which was about 15 yards on the other side of the man's apartment. The guy sprinted out, running hard towards the door, his keys in hand. He was clumsy, causing a lot of noise as he ran, which got the attention of the closest ghoul. As soon as it turned in his direction, Madison fired and ripped its head clean off. The man froze at the sound of the gunshot going off. "Move," Madison barked in frustration. He snapped out of his shock and ran up to the door as zombies from the other side continued to run towards him. Madison had the lead one in her sights, waiting for the last moment to pull the trigger because she didn't want to waste the ammo if she didn't have to. The man got his key in the door and opened it, rushing inside and slamming the door shut behind him. As soon as that happened, Madison slammed her own door shut and immediately ran up the stairs. She'd just put a lot of heat on herself, and she needed to move. She made it 2 more flights before the door below came crashing open from the running ghouls that were pursuing her. She made it up to the 6th floor, pulling open the door and rushing into the hallway, slamming it shut behind her. As soon as the noise echoed in the hallway, she knew she'd made a mistake. She whirled and raised her handgun, aiming down the long hallway. There were doors on both sides, and about 30 yards up ahead, the hallway opened and branched out. Several zombies ran down the hallway towards her, excited by the noise. She moved up to the first apartment. "Need 645, she muttered, and the first number she spotted was 601. Son of a bitch. She squeezed off a few rounds, taking down the 2 closest zombies that were coming her way. She ran hard, keeping her weapon up as the sounds of moans and footsteps echoed throughout the cavernous 6th floor. As she approached the opening, a couple more creatures came around the corner and met the same fate as the others who had dared to come after her. She made it to the opening and saw the open stairwell across the way, as well as the nice public meeting area. There were a couple dozen zombies that were all around, and all of them were focused on her. She glanced at the sign on the wall, which pointed to the right as the direction she needed. She took off running, firing a few more shots towards the ghouls that were nearby, down the wall of apartments. The numbers ticked up and up. 635, 636. She counted ahead, spotting the target apartment at the corner. She glanced over her shoulder at a half-dozen creatures within 10 yards of her. Directly behind her, another couple coming at her from the left. Never going to make it, she thought. And not only that, there wouldn't be enough time at the door for her to be let in, even if the doc was expecting her, which she wasn't. Madison cut hard to the left, towards the social area, where there were chairs and couches spread out. Forced to take evasive maneuvers, she headed towards a semicircle setup of furniture, leaping over the back of a couch, hitting the ground running before jumping over another couch. This caused the zombies chasing her to run straight into the back of the couch, tumbling over face first onto the ground. They quickly scrambled to their feet and continued pursuit, and Madison circled back towards the apartment. She made it to the door, banging on it and yelling as she took aim to fire. "Dr. Betty McGill," she cried, "I need you to let me in now." She squeezed off a couple of shots, hitting the closest zombies that were 15 yards away and closing. "I'm a government agent here to help you," she barked. A few more shots, and the front edge of the zombies were within 8 yards. "Betty, open the door now!" she screamed. Madison fired a few more shots, and the door behind her cracked open. She threw herself into it, knocking the woman behind the door back. But there was no time, and Madison slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt just as the zombies reached it and began slamming and slapping on it, moaning with the hunger of the dead. She spotted the secondary deadbolt and threw that for good measure. She admired the big metal door, which wasn't moving a hair under the pressure of the zombies outside. Behind her, someone moaned on the floor. Madison whirled, finding a middle-aged blonde woman in a sitting position with a fair-sized welt on her forehead. "Oh, God! I'm so sorry," Madison gushed, dropping her bags to the floor. "Here, let me help you." She helped the woman, apparently the Dr. Betty McGill, to her feet, waiting until she was steady before letting go of her. "It's okay," she finally said. "I'm fine." She paused. "Well, all things considered, that is." Betty focused on the agent who had just burst into her home. "Now, who are you, and why are you in my apartment?" "Have you seen what's going on outside?" Madison asked. The doctor wrinkled her nose. You mean my friends and neighbors ripping each other to shreds? She asked dryly. Yeah, I'm aware. That's happening everywhere, Madison explained. Not just in town, but all over the country, and most likely the world. Betty gasped at her. What? She breathed. How? It's a long story, Doc, but let's just say there's a reason I'm on your doorstep. The other woman thought for a moment, then blinked at her. So it's something viral, she asked. Madison nodded. Yep, afraid so, she said. I have so many questions, Betty said, shaking her head. Where did it start? What's the infection rate, mortality rate, including? Madison held up her hands. I'm sure somebody has those answers for you. However, I'm not the person that does. She cut in. My only role is to keep you safe until the cavalry arrives. The doctor shivered, staring at her with wide eyes. And when's that? She asked. Probably a week, the agent replied. Maybe 2, depending on how bad it gets out there. Betty swallowed hard. I haven't been to the store lately, she admitted. Madison leaned over and unzipped her duffel bag. Some of the stuff tastes like warmed-up cardboard, but some of it isn't too bad, she said. It will keep us alive, though. The doctor eyed it, letting out a deep sigh of relief, her eyes shining a bit with tears. Thank you, she said. Just doing my job, Doc, Madison said. Still, Betty insisted, if you hadn't come along, I most certainly would have starved to death. Madison cocked a brow. You can thank me by using that big brain of yours to fix whatever the hell is going on out there, she said. That's a tall order, but I'll get my best, Betty replied. The agent nodded. Okay, I can live with that, she said. You could also thank me with a glass of water and something stronger if you have it. The doctor waved her into the kitchen. I've got some vodka and tonic water, she asked. I'll take one of those. A double, if you don't mind, Madison said, exhaustion finally settling over her shoulders now that she was relatively safe. Coming right up, Betty said, and headed into the kitchen to get to work. The agent walked over to the window, taking a seat in a chair facing the city. It was still night outside, but big flickers of light came from numerous fires breaking out. Lights flashed everywhere, with only a couple of them actually moving from their position. Most were stationary, and she knew that the people working those vehicles were most likely dead. A few moments later, Betty came back with a tray of drinks, setting them down on the table beside her. My apologies, she said. I only have a one-bedroom apartment. I do have plenty of pillows and blankets, and the couch is pretty comfy. Madison laughed. Given where I've had to lay my head the last couple of years, this is a significant step up, she said. Thank you. She took a sip of the tonic and let out a soft hoo at the strength hitting her throat. They definitely don't pour them like that at the bars, she drawled. Damn, Betty, you got the magic touch there. The doctor shrugged as she sat on the couch. I got a case of the stuff, and I doubt we'll be able to take it with us, she explained. Might as well get some enjoyment. She looked back to her apartment door, where zombies still banged on it with excitement, especially since we're not going anywhere, anytime soon. They looked out the window at the carnage unfolding on the streets below, silent for a time. How bad is this going to be? Betty finally asked, voice soft. Madison contemplated this for a moment and took another long, burning sip before responding. I tell you what, Doc, she drawled. You pour yourself one of these and I'll tell you everything I know about it. It's so bad I need a drink, Betty asked. Better bring the bottle, the agent replied solemnly. A wave of emotions washed over the doctor's face, the gravity of the situation taking a while to sink in. She finally nodded and headed back to the kitchen to make another drink. Madison continued sipping and watching the city descend into madness. She fixated on the emergency lights bathing the buildings in vibrant color, almost hypnotic in a way. She let her mind go, not even thinking of anything, just allowing herself to actually be in stunned silence for the first time since everything had begun. Finally, her trance was broken by Betty coming over and sitting down beside her. She set the bottle of vodka on the tray as well. "Got my drink," she said, taking a deep breath, ready to hear it all. Madison nodded, raising her glass in a toast. "To new friends as the world ends," she said. Betty took a fearful breath and raised her drink, clinking glasses. The women settled in with their drinks, and the agent began to tell her tale, ready for a long night. The end.